The starting point of modern industry is, as we have shown, the revolution in the instruments of labor, and this revolution attains its most highly developed form in the organized system of machinery in a factory. Before we inquire how human material is incorporated with this objective organism, let us consider some general effects of this revolution on the laborer himself. A appropriation of supplementary labor power by capital. The employment of women and children insofar as machinery dispenses with muscular power, it becomes a means of employing laborers of slight muscular strength, and those whose bodily development is incomplete, but whose limbs are all the more supple. The labor of women and children was, therefore, the first thing sought for by capitalists who used machinery. That mighty substitute for labor and laborers was forthwith changed into a means for increasing the number of wage laborers by enrolling, under the direct sway of capital, every member of the workman's family, without distinction of age or sex. Compulsory work for the capitalist usurped the place, not only of the children's play, but also of free labor at home within moderate limits for the support of the family. The value of labor power was determined, not only by the labor time necessary to maintain the individual adult laborer, but also by that necessary to maintain his family. Machinery, by throwing every member of that family onto the labor market, spreads the value of the man's labor power over his whole family. It thus depreciates his labor power. To purchase the labor power of a family of 4 workers may, perhaps, cost more than it formerly did to purchase the labor power of the head of the family, but in return, 4 days' labor takes the place of 1, and their price falls in proportion to the excess of the surplus labor of 4 over the surplus labor of 1. In order that the family may live, 4 people must now not only labor but expend surplus labor for the capitalist. Thus we see that machinery, while augmenting the human material that forms the principal object of capital's exploiting power, at the same time raises the degree of exploitation. Machinery also revolutionizes out and out the contract between the laborer and the capitalist, which formally fixes their mutual relation. Taking the exchange of commodities as our basis, our first assumption was that capitalist and laborer met as free persons, as independent owners of commodities, the one possessing money and means of production, the other labor power. But now the capitalist buys children and young persons under age. Previously, the workman sold his own labor power, which he disposed of nominally as a free agent. Now he sells wife and child. He has become a slave dealer. The demand for children's labor often resembles in form the inquiries for Negro slaves, such as were formerly to be read among the advertisements in American journal. My attention, says an English factory inspector, was drawn to an advertisement in the local paper of one of the most important manufacturing towns of my district, of which the following is a copy, wanted to young persons, not younger than what can pass for years. Wages shillings a week. Apply, and married women who work in gangs along with boys and girls are, for a stipulated sum of money placed at the disposal of the farmer, by a man called the undertaker, who contracts for the whole gang. These gangs will sometimes travel many miles from their own village. They are to be met morning and evening on the roads, dressed in short petticoats, with suitable coats and boots, and sometimes trousers, looking wonderfully strong and healthy, but tainted with a customary immorality and heedless of the fatal results which their love of this busy and independent life is bringing on their unfortunate offspring who are pining at home. Every phenomenon of the factory districts is here reproduced, including, but to a greater extent, ill-disguised infanticide and dosing children with opiates. My knowledge of such evils, says Dr. Simon, the medical officer of the Privy Council and editor-in-chief of the Reports on Public Health, may excuse the profound misgiving with which I regard any large industrial employment of adult women. Happy indeed, exclaims Mr. Baker, the factory inspector, in his official report, happy indeed will it be for the manufacturing districts of England, when every married woman having a family is prohibited from working in any textile works at all. The moral degradation caused by the capitalistic exploitation of women and children has been so exhaustively depicted by F. Engels in his Lage der Arbeitenden in Class Englands, and other writers, that I need only mention the subject in this place. The intellectual desolation artificially produced by converting immature human beings into mere machines for the fabrication of surplus value, a state of mind clearly distinguishable from that natural ignorance which keeps the mind fallow without destroying its capacity for development, its natural fertility. This desolation finally compelled even the English Parliament to make elementary education a compulsory condition to the productive employment of children under year. In every industry subject to the Factory Acts, The spirit of capitalist production stands out clearly in the ludicrous wording of the so-called education clauses in the Factory Acts, in the absence of an administrative machinery, an absence that again makes the compulsion illusory, in the opposition of the manufacturers themselves to these education clauses, and in the tricks and dodges they put in practice for evading them. For this the legislature is alone to blame, by having passed a delusive law, which, while it would seem to provide that the children employed in factories shall be educated, contains no enactment by which that professed end can be secured. It provides nothing more than that the children shall on certain days of the week, and for a certain number of hours in each day, be enclosed within the four walls of a place called a school, and that the employer of the child shall receive weekly a certificate to that effect signed by a person designated by the subscriber as a schoolmaster or schoolmistress. Previous to the passing of the amended Factory Act, it happened, not unfrequently, that the certificates of attendance at school were signed by the schoolmaster or schoolmistress with a cross, as they themselves were unable to write. The inspectors, when the bill was in preparation, did not fail to represent the disgraceful state of the places called schools, certificates from which they were obliged to admit as a compliance with the laws, but they were successful only in obtaining thus much, that since the passing of the Act of, the figures in the school certificate must be filled up in the handwriting of the schoolmaster, who must also sign his Christian and surname in full. Sir John Kincaid, factory inspector for Scotland, relates experiences of the same kind. The first school we visited was kept by a Mrs. Ann Killen. Upon asking her to spell her name, she straightway made a mistake, by beginning with the letter C, but correcting herself immediately, she said her name began with a K on looking at her signature. However, in the school certificate books, I noticed that she spelt it in various ways, while her handwriting left no doubt as to her unfitness to teach. She herself also acknowledged that she could not keep the register. In a second school I found the schoolroom feet long and feet wide, and counted in this space children, who were gabbling something unintelligible. But it is not only in the miserable places above referred to that the children obtain certificates of school attendance without having received instruction of any value, for in many schools where there is a competent teacher, his efforts are of little avail from the distracting crowd of children of all ages, from infants of years old and upwards, his livelihood, miserable at the best, depending on the pence received from the greatest number of children whom it is possible to cram into the space. This is to be added scanty school furniture, deficiency of books and other materials for teaching, and the depressing effect upon the poor children themselves of a close, noisome atmosphere. I have been in many such schools, where I have seen rows of children doing absolutely nothing, and this is certified as school attendance, and in statistical returns, such children are set down as being educated. In Scotland, the manufacturers try all they can to do without the children that are obliged to attend school. It requires no further argument to prove that the educational clauses of the Factory Act, being held in such disfavor among mill owners, tend in a great measure to exclude that class of children alike from the employment and the benefit of education contemplated by this act. Horribly grotesque does this appear in print works, which are regulated by a special act. By that act, every child before being employed in a print work must have attended school for at least days, and not less than hours, during the 6 months immediately preceding such first day of employment, and during the continuance of its employment in the print works, it must attend for a like period of days and hours during every successive period of 6 months. The attendance at school must be between, and no attendance of less than a half hours, nor more than hours on any one day, shall be reckoned as part of the hours. Under ordinary circumstances, the children attend school morning and afternoon for days, for at least hours each day, and upon the expiration of the days, the statutory total of hours having been attained, having in their language made up their book, they return to the print work, where they continue until the 6 months have expired, when another installment of school attendance becomes due, and they again seek the school until the book is again made up. Many boys having attended school for the required number of hours, when they return to school after the expiration of their 6 months' work in the print work, are in the same condition as when they first attended school as print work boys, that they have lost all they gained by their previous school attendance. In other print works, the children's attendance at school is made to depend altogether upon the exigencies of the work in the establishment. The requisite number of hours is made up each 6 months, by installments consisting of from 2 hours at a time, spreading over, perhaps, the whole 6 months. For instance, the attendance on one day might be from 2, on another day from 2, and the child might not appear at school again for several days, when it would attend from 2. Then it might attend 4 or days consecutively, or for a week. Then it would not appear in school for weeks or a month, after that upon some odd days at some odd hours when the operative who employed it chose to spare it, and thus the child was, as it were, buffeted from school to work, from work to school, until the tale of hours was told. By the excessive addition of women and children to the ranks of the workers, machinery at last breaks down the resistance which the male operatives in the manufacturing period continued to oppose to the despotism of capital. The prolongation of the working day, if machinery be the most powerful means for increasing the productiveness of labor, for shortening the working time required in the production of a commodity, it becomes in the hands of capital the most powerful means, in those industries first invaded by it, for lengthening the working day beyond all bounds set by human nature. It creates, on the one hand, new conditions by which capital is enabled to give free scope to this its constant tendency, and on the other hand, new motives with which to whet capital's appetite for the labor of others. In the first place, in the form of machinery, the implements of labor become automatic, things moving and working independent of the workman. They are thenceforth an industrial perpetuum mobile that would go on producing forever, did it not meet with certain natural obstructions in the weak bodies and the strong wills of its human attendants. The automaton, as capital, and because it is capital, is endowed, in the person of the capitalist, with intelligence and will. It is therefore animated by the longing to reduce to a minimum the resistance offered by that repellent, yet elastic natural barrier, man. This resistance is moreover lessened by the apparent lightness of machine work, and by the more pliant and docile character of the women and children employed on it. The productiveness of machinery is, as we saw, inversely proportional to the value transferred by it to the product. The longer the life of the machine, the greater is the mass of the products over which the value transmitted by the machine is spread, and the less is the portion of that value added to each single commodity. The active lifetime of a machine is, however, clearly dependent on the length of the working day, or on the duration of the daily labor process, multiplied by the number of days for which the process is carried on. The wear and tear of a machine is not exactly proportional to its working time. And even if it were so, a machine working hours daily for half years covers as long a working period as, and transmits to the total product no more value than, the same machine would if it worked only hours daily for years. But in the first case, the value of the machine would be reproduced twice as quickly as in the latter, and the capitalist would, by this use of the machine, absorb in a half years as much surplus value as in the second case he would in. The material wear and tear of a machine is of two kinds. The one arises from use, as coins wear away by circulating, the other from non-use, as a sword rusts when left in its scabbard. The latter kind is due to the elements. The former is more or less directly proportional, the latter to a certain extent inversely proportional to the use of the machine. But in addition to the material wear and tear, a machine also undergoes what we may call a moral depreciation. It loses exchange value, either by machines of the same sort being produced cheaper than it, or by better machines entering into competition with it. In both cases, be the machine ever so young and full of life, its value is no longer determined by the labor actually materialized in it, but by the labor time requisite to reproduce either it or the better machine. It has, therefore, lost value more or less. The shorter the period taken to reproduce its total value, the less is the danger of moral depreciation, and the longer the working day, the shorter is that period. When machinery is first introduced into an industry, new methods of reproducing it more cheaply follow blow upon blow, and so do improvements that not only affect individual parts and details of the machine, but its entire bill. It is, therefore, in the early days of the life of machinery that this special incentive to the prolongation of the working day makes itself felt most acutely. Machinery produces relative surplus value, not only by directly depreciating the value of labor power, and by indirectly cheapening the same through cheapening the commodities that enter into its reproduction, but also, when it is first introduced sporadically into an industry, by converting the labor employed by the owner of that machinery into labor of a higher degree and greater efficacy, by raising the social value of the article produced above its individual value, and thus enabling the capitalist to replace the value of a day's labor power by a smaller portion of the value of a day's product. During this transition period, when the use of machinery is a sort of monopoly, the profits are therefore exceptional, and the capitalist endeavors to exploit thoroughly the sunny time of this his first love, by prolonging the working day as much as possible. The magnitude of the profit whets his appetite for more profit. See intensification of labor. The immoderate lengthening of the working day, produced by machinery in the hands of capital, leads to a reaction on the part of society, the very sources of whose life are menaced, and thence to a normal working day whose length is fixed by law. Thenceforth a phenomenon that we have already met with, namely, the intensification of labor, develops into great importance. Our analysis of absolute surplus value had reference primarily to the extension or duration of the labor, its intensity being assumed as given. We now proceed to consider the substitution of a more intensified labor for labor of more extensive duration, and the degree of the former. It is self-evident that in proportion as the use of machinery spreads, and the experience of a special class of workmen habituated to machinery accumulates, the rapidity and intensity of labor increase as a natural consequence. Thus in England, during half a century, lengthening of the working day went hand in hand with increasing intensity of factory labor. Nevertheless, the reader will clearly see that where we have labor, not carried on by fits and starts, but repeated day after day with unvarying uniformity, a point must inevitably be reached, where extension of the working day and intensity of the labor mutually exclude one another, in such a way that lengthening of the working day becomes compatible only with a lower degree of intensity, and a higher degree of intensity only with a shortening of the working day. As soon as the gradually surging revolt of the working class compelled Parliament to shorten compulsorily the hours of labor, and to begin by imposing a normal working day on factories proper, so soon consequently as an increased production of surplus value by the prolongation of the working day was once for all put a stop to. From that moment capital threw itself with all its might into the production of relative surplus value, by hastening on the further improvement of machinery. At the same time, a change took place in the nature of relative surplus value. Generally speaking, the mode of producing relative surplus value consists in raising the productive power of the workman, so as to enable him to produce more in a given time with the same expenditure of labor. Labor time continues to transmit as before the same value to the total product, but this unchanged amount of exchange value is spread over more use value, hence the value of each single commodity sinks. Otherwise, however, so soon as the compulsory shortening of the hours of labor takes place, the immense impetus it gives the development of productive power, and to economy in the means of production, imposes on the workman increased expenditure of labor in a given time, heightened tension of labor power, and closer filling up of the pores of the working day, or condensation of labor to a degree that is attainable only within the limits of the shortened working day. This condensation of a greater mass of labor into a given period thenceforward counts for what it really is, a greater quantity of labor. In addition to a measure of its extension, duration, labor now acquires a measure of its intensity or of the degree of its condensation or density. The denser hour of the 10 hours working day contains more labor, expended labor power than the more porous hour of the 12 hours working day. The product, therefore, of one of the former hours has as much or more value than has the product of divided by of the latter hours. Apart from the increased yield of relative surplus value through the heightened productiveness of labor, the same mass of value is now produced for the capitalist, say, by divided by hours of surplus labor, and divided by hours of necessary labor, as was previously produced by 4 hours of surplus labor and 8 hours of necessary labor. We now come to the question, how is the labor intensified? First effect of shortening the working day results from the self-evident law that the efficiency of labor power is in an inverse ratio to the duration of its expenditure. Hence, within certain limits, what is lost by shortening the duration is gained by the increasing tension of labor power. That the workman, moreover, really does expend more labor power is ensured by the mode in which the capitalist pays him. In those industries, such as potteries, where machinery plays little or no part, the introduction of the factory acts has strikingly shown that the mere shortening of the working day increases to a wonderful degree the regularity, uniformity, order, continuity, and energy of the labor. It seemed, however, doubtful whether this effect was produced in the factory proper, where the dependence of the workman on the continuous and uniform motion of the machinery had already created the strictest discipline. Hence, when in the reduction of the working day to less than 12 hours was being debated, the masters almost unanimously declared the shortening of the hours of labor creates, to begin with, the subjective conditions for the condensation of labor, by enabling the workman to exert more strength in a given time. As soon as that shortening becomes compulsory, machinery becomes in the hands of capital the objective means, systematically employed for squeezing out more labor in a given time. This is effected in 2 ways, by increasing the speed of the machinery, and by giving the workman more machinery to tend. Improved construction of the machinery is necessary, partly because without it greater pressure cannot be put on the workman, and partly because the shortened hours of labor force the capitalist to exercise the strictest watch over the cost of production. The improvements in the steam engine have increased the piston speed, and at the same time have made it possible, by means of a greater economy of power, to drive with the same or even a smaller consumption of coal more machinery with the same engine. The improvements in the transmitting mechanism have lessened friction, and what so strikingly distinguishes modern from the older machinery, have reduced the diameter and weight of the shafting to a constantly decreasing minimum. Finally, the improvements in the operative machines have, while reducing their size, increased their speed and efficiency, as in the modern power loom, or, while increasing the size of their framework, have also increased the extent and number of their working parts, as in spinning mules, or have added to the speed of these working parts by imperceptible alterations of detail, such as those which 10 years ago increased the speed of the spindles in self-acting mules by 1/5. The reduction of the working day to hours dates in England from. And a manufacturer stated, the labor now undergone in the factories is much greater than it used to be, compared with 30 or 40 years ago, owing to the greater attention and activity required by the greatly increased speed which is given to the machinery. The year Lord Ashley, now Lord Shaftesbury, made in the House of Commons the following statements, supported by documentary evidence. In the face of this remarkable intensity of labor which had already been reached in under the 12 Hours Act, there appeared to be a justification for the assertion made at that time by the English manufacturers, that any further progress in that direction was impossible, and therefore that every further reduction of the hours of labor meant a lessened production. The apparent correctness of their reasons will be best shown by the following contemporary statement by Leonard Horner, the factory inspector, their ever-watchful censor. We now come to the period that follows the introduction of the 10 Hours Act into the English cotton, woolen, silk, and flax mill. The speed of the spindles has increased upon throstles, and upon mules revolutions a minute. The speed of the throstle spindle, which in was times a minute, is now, and of the mule spindle that was is now times a minute, amounting in the former case to 1/10, and in the second case to 1/5 additional increase. James Nasmyth, the eminent civil engineer of Patricroft, near Manchester, explained in a letter to Leonard Horner, written in the nature of the improvements in the steam engine that had been made between the years and. After remarking that the horsepower of steam engines, being always estimated in the official returns according to the power of similar engines is only nominal, and can serve only as an index of their real power, he goes on to say, the great improvements made in machines of every kind have raised their productive power very much. Without any doubt, the shortening of the hours of labor gave the impulse to these improvements. The latter, combined with the more intense strain on the workmen, have had the effect that at least as much is produced in the shortened working day as was previously produced during the longer one. One fact is sufficient to show how greatly the wealth of the manufacturers increased along with the more intense exploitation of labor power. From 2, the average proportional increase in English cotton and other factories was %, while from 2 it amounted to %. But however great the progress of English industry had been during the years from 2 under the influence of a working day of hours, it was far surpassed during the next period of years from 2. In silk factories, for instance, there were spindles in looms but the number of operatives was in. The increase in the spindles was therefore %, and in the looms %, while the number of the operatives decreased %. In the year there were employed in worsted mills spindles in. But if we deduct the doubling spindles that figure in the numbers for, but not in those for, it will be found that after the number of spindles remained nearly stationary. On the other hand, after, the speed of the spindles and looms was in many cases doubled. The number of power looms in worsted mills was in. The number of the operatives was in. Included in these, however, the children under years of age were in. In spite, therefore, of the greatly increased number of looms compared with, the total number of the workpeople employed decreased, and that of the children exploited increased. On the April, Mr. Farron said in the House of Commons, I have been informed by delegates from districts of Lancashire and Cheshire, in whose behalf I speak, that the work in the factories is, in consequence of the improvements in machinery, constantly on the increase. Instead of as formerly one person with 2 helps tenting 2 looms, one person now tents 3 looms without helps, and it is no uncommon thing for one person to tent 4. 12 hours' work, as is evident from the facts adduced, is now compressed into less than hours. It is therefore self-evident to what an enormous extent the toil of the factory operative has increased during the last year. Although, therefore, the factory inspectors unceasingly and with justice commend the results of the acts of, and yet they admit that the shortening of the hours of labor has already called forth such an intensification of the labor as is injurious to the health of the workman and to his capacity for work. In most of the cotton, worsted, and silk mills, an exhausting state of excitement necessary to enable the workers satisfactorily to mind the machinery, the motion of which has been greatly accelerated within the last few years, seems to me not unlikely to be one of the causes of that excessive mortality from lung disease, which Dr. Greenhow has pointed out in his recent report on this subject. There cannot be the slightest doubt that the tendency that urges capital, so soon as a prolongation of the hours of labor is once for all forbidden, to compensate itself by a systematic heightening of the intensity of labor, and to convert every improvement in machinery into a more perfect means of exhausting the workman, must soon lead to a state of things in which a reduction of the hours of labor will again be inevitable. On the other hand, the rapid advance of English industry between and the present time, under the influence of a day of hours, surpasses the advance made between and when the day was hours long, by far more than the latter surpasses the advance made during the half-century after the first introduction of the factory system, when the working day was without limits. At the commencement of this chapter, we considered that which we may call the body of the factory, machinery organized into a system. We there saw how machinery, by annexing the labor of women and children, augments the number of human beings who form the material for capitalistic exploitation, how it confiscates the whole of the workman's disposable time, by a moderate extension of the hours of labor, and how finally its progress, which allows of enormous increase of production in shorter and shorter periods, serves as a means of systematically getting more work done in a shorter time, or of exploiting labor power more intensely. We now turn to the factory as a whole, and that in its most perfect form. Dr. Ure, the Pindar of the automatic factory, describes it on the one hand as combined cooperation of many orders of workpeople, adult and young, intending with assiduous skill, a system of productive machines continuously impelled by a central power. On the other hand, as a vast automaton composed of various mechanical and intellectual organs, acting in uninterrupted concert for the production of a common object, all of them being subordinate to a self-regulated moving force. These two descriptions are far from being identical. In one, the collective laborer or social body of labor appears as the dominant subject, and the mechanical automaton as the object. In the other, the automaton itself is the subject, and the workmen are merely conscious organs, coordinate with the unconscious organs of the automaton, and together with them, subordinated to the central moving power. The first description is applicable to every possible employment of machinery on a large scale. The second is characteristic of its use by capital, and therefore of the modern factory system. Ure prefers, therefore, to describe the central machine from which the motion comes, not only as an automaton but as an autocrat. In these spacious halls the benignant power of steam summons around him his myriads of willing menials. Along with the tool, the skill of the workman in handling it passes over to the machine. The capabilities of the tool are emancipated from the restraints that are inseparable from human labor power. Thereby the technical foundation on which is based the division of labor in manufacture is swept away. Hence, in the place of the hierarchy of specialized workmen that characterizes manufacture, there steps, in the automatic factory, a tendency to equalize and reduce to one, and the same level every kind of work that has to be done by the minders of the machines. In the place of the artificially produced differentiations of the detail workmen, step the natural differences of age and sex. So far as division of labor reappears in the factory, it is primarily a distribution of the workmen among the specialized machines, and of masses of workmen, not however organized into groups, among the various departments of the factory, in each of which they work at a number of similar machines placed together. Their cooperation, therefore, is only simple. The organized group, peculiar to manufacture, is replaced by the connection between the head workman and his few assistants. The essential division is into workmen who are actually employed on the machines, and into mere attendants of these workmen. Among the attendants are reckoned more or less all feeders, who supply the machines with the material to be worked. In addition to these two principal classes, there is a numerically unimportant class of persons, whose occupation it is to look after the whole of the machinery and repair it from time to time, such as engineers, mechanics, joiners, and this is a superior class of workmen, some of them scientifically educated, others brought up to trade. It is distinct from the factory operative class and merely aggregated to it. This division of labor is purely technical. To work at a machine, the workman should be taught from childhood, in order that he may learn to adapt his own movements to the uniform and unceasing motion of an automaton. When the machinery, as a whole, forms a system of manifold machines, working simultaneously and in concert, the cooperation based upon it requires the distribution of various groups of workmen among the different kinds of machines. But the employment of machinery does away with the necessity of crystallizing this distribution after the manner of manufacture, by the constant annexation of a particular man to a particular function. Since the motion of the whole system does not proceed from the workman, but from the machinery, a change of persons can take place at any time without an interruption of the work. The most striking proof of this is afforded by the relay system, put into operation by the manufacturers during their revolt from. Lastly, the quickness with which machine work is learnt by young people does away with the necessity of bringing up for exclusive employment by machinery a special class of operatives. With regard to the work of the mere attendants, it can, to some extent, be replaced in the mill by machines, and owing to its extreme simplicity, it allows of a rapid and constant change of the individual's burden with this drudgery. Although then, technically speaking, the old system of division of labor is thrown overboard by machinery, it hangs on in the factory, as a traditional habit handed down from manufacture, and is afterwards systematically remolded and established in a more hideous form by capital, as a means of exploiting labor power. The lifelong speciality of handling one and the same tool now becomes the lifelong speciality of serving one and the same machine. Machinery is put to a wrong use, with the object of transforming the workman from his very childhood into a part of a detail machine. In this way, not only are the expenses of his reproduction considerably lessened, but at the same time his helpless dependence upon the factory as a whole, and therefore upon the capitalist, is rendered complete. Here, as everywhere else, we must distinguish between the increased productiveness due to the development of the social process of production, and that due to the capitalist exploitation of that process. In handicrafts and manufacture, the workman makes use of a tool; in the factory, the machine makes use of him. There the movements of the instrument of labor proceed from him; here it is the movements of the machine that he must follow. In manufacture, the workmen are parts of a living mechanism. In the factory, we have a lifeless mechanism independent of the workman, who becomes its mere living appendage. The miserable routine of endless drudgery and toil in which the same mechanical process is gone through over and over again is like the labor of Sisyphus. The burden of labor, like the rock, keeps ever falling back on the worn-out laborer. The factory operatives should keep in wholesome remembrance the fact that theirs is really a low species of skilled labor, and that there is none which is more easily acquired, or of its quality more amply remunerated, or which by a short training of the least expert can be more quickly, as well as abundantly, acquired. The master's machinery really plays a far more important part in the business of production than the labor and the skill of the operative, which 6 months' education can teach, and a common laborer can learn. The technical subordination of the workman to the uniform motion of the instruments of labor, and the peculiar composition of the body of workpeople, consisting as it does of individuals of both sexes and of all ages, give rise to a barrack discipline, which is elaborated into a complete system in the factory, and which fully develops the before-mentioned labor of overlooking, thereby dividing the workpeople into operatives and overlookers, into private soldiers and sergeants of an industrial army. The main difficulty lay, above all, in training human beings to renounce their desultory habits of work, and to identify themselves with the unvarying regularity of the complex automata. To devise and administer a successful code of factory discipline, suited to the necessities of factory diligence, was the Herculean enterprise, the noble achievement of Arkwright. Even at the present day, when the system is perfectly organized, and its labor lightened to the utmost, it is found nearly impossible to convert persons past the age of puberty into useful factory hands. Factory code in which capital formulates, like a private legislator, and at his own good will, his autocracy over his workpeople, unaccompanied by that division of responsibility, in other matters so much approved of by the bourgeoisie, and unaccompanied by the still more approved representative system. This code is but the capitalistic caricature of that social regulation of the labor process which becomes requisite in cooperation on a great scale, and in the employment in common of instruments of labor and especially of machinery. The place of the slave driver's lash is taken by the overlooker's book of penalty. All punishments naturally resolve themselves into fines and deductions from wages, and the law-giving talent of the factory Lycurgus so arranges matters that a violation of his laws is, if possible, more profitable to him than the keeping of them. shall here merely allude to the material conditions under which factory labor is carried on. Every organ of sense is injured in an equal degree by artificial elevation of the temperature, by the dust-laden atmosphere, by the deafening noise, not to mention danger to life and limb among the thickly crowded machinery, which, with the regularity of the seasons, issues its list of the killed and wounded in the industrial battle. Economy of the social means of production, matured and forced as in a hothouse by the factory system, is turned, in the hands of capital, into systematic robbery of what is necessary for the life of the workman while he is at work, robbery of space, light, air, and of protection to his person against the dangerous and unwholesome accompaniments of the productive process, not to mention the robbery of appliances for the comfort of the work. Is Fourier wrong when he calls factories tempered bagnos?